There's a very good reason why we suddenly became this burgeoning epicenter for it.
There's a lot of extremely attractive things about setting up shop in the Southeast, whether it's, for your employees that you have a low cost of living, you have national labs, you have top universities, you have folks that have expertise in metallurgy, materials, lots of very good engineering schools. It's not a coincidence that things are popping up because we were ready for this before the rest of the country was ready for this.
You've heard a lot about electric vehicles. Here's a twist you probably didn't see coming. Georgia, right here in the South, is leading the country in EV manufacturing investment. From the factory floor to your driveway, we'll connect the dots between innovation, industry, and everyday life. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Battery Belt podcast, presented to you by the Georgia Network for Electric Mobility. For the last decade, we've been talking about batteries. We've mostly talked about them in terms of electric vehicles, laptops, etc. Battery demand was very much synonymous with EV demand, especially when thinking about gigafactories planned around vehicle forecasts, as well as public policy centered around transportation electrification. But we're entering a different phase. EV adoption has been moderating, normalizing, fragmenting, both in the US and across the world. Some OEMs are recalibrating production. At the same time, utilities are facing accelerating load growth from EV charging, data centers, advanced manufacturing, and industrial electrification. Battery manufacturers are truly reassessing how and where their battery manufacturing capacity should be allocated. So the question becomes, is stationary storage or battery energy stationary storage becoming or emerging as the new major demand wave? We are really excited in the Southeast, where we've seen over $70 billion in battery and EV manufacturing investment to kind of see how the new investments in battery energy storage affect chemistry choices, critical mineral strategy, manufacturing utilization, and workforce development. We're really, really excited to have with us today Bill Mustain or William Mustain, whichever one you prefer. Feel free to correct me on that one. And he's the director for the Carolina Institute for Battery Innovation. And to start us off, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, in your opinion, what is the battery belt and why should we care about it?
I've seen the other episode, so I was looking forward to this, and I thought, this is almost a philosophical question right at the beginning.
It
So
is.
I started to think about this as like, okay, so obviously the namesake comes from the Bible Belt, right? And if you thought of a generic way to think about that, right, the Bible Belt is like a region of the Southeast US where like evangelical Christianity like exerts a strong social and cultural influence, right? So how do we think about this like same way and not just make it a geographical thing, but also, something very similar to that? And I apologize if I blaspheme anybody, but the idea here maybe would be that the battery belt is this region of the Southeast United States that strongly influences or evangelizes the social and political acceptance of battery energy storage through job creation, technology development, and manufacturing, the things that we're really good at here.
Yeah, that might be what it becomes, right? Is there's enough momentum for it if they want to do it. The other things I've heard it compared to in terms of belts is Sun Belt and Rust Belt, like all of these other kind of social commentary, news headliney type titles that get assigned to places, and then the places get to decide what they mean for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah, the
It's
thing, if you
very
tried to link
similar.
that with the Rust Belt, I don't want to link it necessarily like that here because to me, that gives this connotation that you have to revitalize something that has come and gone and then you're going to repurpose it. Living in South Carolina, a large fraction of our economy is manufacturing, whether it's aerospace or automotive. And so I think that's an incredibly vibrant part of our economy, and the same thing in Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, et cetera. So you get this series of at least four states that I'm more knowledgeable about, I guess, that I don't think of it as revitalization. I think that it's one of the reasons why our region is growing faster than almost any other region in the United States.
I like the point that you're making about not calling it revitalization because our region of the 6 to 7 states that are in the battery belt, the Southeast battery belt, ha already had a lot of manufacturing infrastructure across several things that become clear inputs in the electrotechnical stack for battery manufacturing and EV manufacturing and automotive manufacturing. There's a very good reason why we suddenly became this burgeoning epicenter for it. And it's not by accident per se, and it's not necessarily revitalization. It's just the birth of a new strategic economic driver or industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I mean, you said an economic driver. There's a lot of extremely attractive things about setting up shop in the Southeast, whether it's, for your employees that you have a low cost of living. In South Carolina, we're also a right to work state, which is very attractive from a business perspective. We have in South Carolina, we have like SC Ready, which is a very strong program that supports the technical college system. So not only in that group of 4 states I mentioned before, and then like let's also say like Tennessee is included there and so on. You have national labs, you have top universities, you have folks that have expertise in metallurgy, materials, lots of very good engineering schools. At USC, we're super strong in batteries. I think it's not a coincidence that things are popping up because we were ready for this before the rest of the country was ready for this.
Exactly, exactly. So, to dive into this a bit more, I'd love to talk more about reframing battery demand and where battery demand is going next. So, for the past 4 or 5 years, we've mostly been framing battery demand through the EV lens because that's where a lot of the rapid growth for new sales was going. Last year, I've seen some numbers that say a 53% increase. I've seen some numbers that say a 79% increase in battery energy storage deployment in the US. Are we entering this phase where stationary storage becomes a dominant demand driver, or do you think that's overstated?
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting about, I don't think that it can be overstated that grid scale, or let's just call battery energy storage and forget grid for just a moment, is accelerating very, very quickly. I think it's a little overblown that EVs are slowing to the extent that people believe that they are. I think a lot of folks believe that almost nobody's buying an EV.
Yeah, we still sold 1.3 million new EVs last year.
Yeah, exactly. And almost, every third or fourth person I talk to at the university or friends of mine, they're either buying an EV or they're considering buying an EV or they're settling somewhere in the middle, like buying a hybrid. And so, I mean, that might not be a full electric vehicle, but we are thinking about batteries in vehicles as not just some future technology, but something that's really important to increase things like efficiency and all that stuff. So I think the EVs are dying is a narrative that's more people politicizing the discipline as opposed to it being reality. And if you look at a global scale, there are places like China, for example, that now have gone over 50% new vehicle EVs. So from a global perspective, it's super overblown. But I don't think that you could overstate the importance of energy storage systems, and it's because we did not follow this thing that everybody thought was going to happen, which I like to call the business school hockey stick, right? Everybody in business school, if you don't have exponential growth, your company's supposed to die at the end. And so we planned for this globally. And what happened, especially in China, was we still have something like 2 to 3 times excess capacity on the mining side, on the materials processing side, on the cell manufacturing side. So prices dropped precipitously. And then suddenly, these cases for energy storage systems that the economics didn't work out like 2, 3, 4 years ago, suddenly they worked out really well. And as soon as you have an economic value, people go because you want to make money. The other thing that I know that we didn't see coming maybe 5 years ago, maybe we is too broad. Somebody saw this coming. I was not one, and I know a lot of people who did not expect the sort of data, AI-driven data center
Yeah.
adoption to be so fast. And of course, batteries play a huge role in data centers.
Yeah, no, I think those three simultaneous trends that you just noted are actually really important because that's something I've been talking about a lot lately about how in earlier EV phases, part of why we saw like the original hockey stick growth that everyone expected was because we suddenly had battery cost curve reduction. Like in 2010, on average, your battery was costing you 1100 US dollars per kilowatt, and
Yep.
now it's closer to like 110 to 150 per kilowatt is what I've
Yep.
seen. And it's both that sudden cost reduction that drove the EVs initially, but is also what is driving the battery energy storage. It's like actually very related in that it's actually just becoming a lot cheaper to make the batteries that have all of these different applications.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And it is really interesting that who you're trying to sell to is very different in the use cases generally. Is that from a vehicle perspective, you're selling to individual consumers, and those individual consumers have their own sort of price points and what new technology is worth to them. So you also have the evangelicals at the beginning. I hate to use that word too many times today, but those who like are early adopters, maybe is a better way to say it. And they just want a cool new technology. And then you get people that sort of jump on the bandwagon as you go along. And then you need to reach a stage where it just becomes economically viable. And so everybody wants to
Right.
do it. And I think we're approaching that. I hope that we can move politics out of this EV adoption part because I do think that it's not, I wouldn't switch to an EV because it's quote unquote green. You even could debate that as a point, quite frankly, depending on where you live, and you'd have a valid argument. Is that I would do it from a performance and efficiency perspective. But then again, I'm a chemical engineer. I think of efficiency all the time. And then
Fair.
at the grid scale, you're talking a company that they don't have to make a decision that's a monthly payment. They have to make an investment that they have to know what the economics are going to be for the next many, many years. And then they amortize how do I say this, the gamble of that over 20, 30 years. And that's why they need that clarity. And so as soon as batteries became significantly less expensive the last few years, dropping by an order of magnitude, a lot of people jumped.
Definitely, definitely. Let's keep on that topic of the utilities, the grid, data centers, and infrastructure. That's like a good place to go next. So, as we've already mentioned, right, utilities are planning for all of these new data needs and grid load management that they need across largely data centers most recently, but also EV charging, industrial electrification, all simultaneously. Where do you think battery storage is most critical right now? Is it the peak shaving? Do you think it's resilience and load management, interconnection issues? Where do you think the battery storage is actually most critical beyond the hype of what's going on in the news?
That's a good question. So I want to pick up maybe that from a data center perspective because it's the really like new one that people are talking about. And most folks that I know of a while ago were thinking of, even last year, we're talking about batteries as something like peak shaving, leveling, voltage regulation. But that's not the case with data centers anymore. So what's happening is that there's a cascade of batteries at data centers now, and the design of data centers, where yes, there are some that are doing those two historical things, those are super important. The other thing is that if you think about the speed that we're building data centers, so there's a 2 year construction timeline. So now you have to think, do I need to get my energy either in front of the meter or behind the meter? So if you're in front of the meter and you need a utility to build batteries, there's a whole lot of regulation behind that. Or if you need a utility to build a natural gas-fired power plant, you need a nuclear power plant to come online. You're talking 5, 10 year deployment, and even to get your behind, or sorry, in front of the meter batteries deployed, you're talking a timeline that is longer than your data center coming online. So you see a lot of these companies now behind the meter installing installing their own gigawatt hour scale energy storage systems. And at that scale, they're doing it because they don't necessarily have the same regulation. They own the batteries, they can control the timeline. So you can now deploy gigawatt hour storage behind the meter in the same time frame that you're building a data center. And that is super, super important to be able to do. And you know that you're going to be able to handle power spikes. You know you're going to be able, let's say, to buy electricity when it's the cheapest, and then you're going to be able to use it during the day when it would be more expensive. And of course, then that changes the economics of what you're going to do. So I think if you think about it from a data center perspective, the behind the meter adoption of batteries is really going to drive that market. I think we do need to prepare for in front of the meter. We need to find ways to continue to invest in the grid, because in the short term, I think these behind the meter solutions are just buying us time. So that way, once we invest in the grid, we actually are able to provide power in real time and then to contribute to sustained growth, not this spike in growth that we can't actually follow up on 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah, no, and I love the distinction between behind the meter versus in front of the meter because it's true. So many of them are building them to build their own little microgrid systems to be semi-self-sufficient as much as they can to keep with the cheaper timelines. Um, I think, hmm. Do you think that any of the stationary storage pieces could absorb some of the recalibrated EV battery manufacturing capacity? Because right now we've heard several announcements on this, right? So Ford has made these announcements, like GM has made announcements to supply Redwood on the data center side.
Hmm.
Uh, Announcements can be optimistic, right? To what extent can they really do this? Because I know that battery manufacturing is really complex. Like, are there any technical constraints that may limit that shift? And what do you expect from all of these announcements that were made by a lot of the automotive industry back in late December and early January?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny, you mentioned Redwood. They're the first one that I thought of. So obviously, Redwood Materials, recycling company, their major facility right now is in Reno. They're building their second facility here in South Carolina. So we've met the South Carolina team, and I was in Reno last year. And one of the things that's really interesting up there is that they were receiving batteries that were sent to them that weren't really ready to be destructively recycled. And so they sort of spun off Redwood Energy and they've set up, I believe it's a 15 megawatt system adjacent to their main recycling facility in Reno. And it's meant simply as a demonstration of, look, we can take EV batteries and we can do second life and to use them for grid scaled energy storage or for a microgrid application. I know for them, one of the really interesting things is that it's very difficult once you have modules in place and you're buying modules or accepting modules. They have unique battery management systems that are on them. You don't want to be the person that is disassembling or trying to disassemble those and then suddenly assemble them into your own packs and modules. So that particular system actually leaves existing modules sitting isolated from the rest, and then they have software over the top of all of those BMSs that manage that particular system. So for modules that were meant or that are coming back and aren't ready to really be recycled, this is an option, especially if you're not land constrained, right? I think that if you're talking about cell manufacturing, though, not module manufacturing, there really is not as wide of a gap in the chemistry as people would want you to believe right now between sort of BESS systems and EV batteries. That, certainly in EVs, there's LFP and LMFP and all kinds of different NMCs. Well, it's the same thing in grid scale storage. So at the cell level, it seems very rational that you could redirect supply chain. And this is what happened. Let's be honest. People thought you were going to be selling batteries from the US, China, and Europe for EV systems. And then as soon as the manufactured cell price dropped, those were supposed to be EV batteries, and now they're going into BESS systems. So at the cell level, I don't see that there's an issue at all. I think obviously how those cells are utilized and controlled changes. But I mean, I think it's an easier shift than some people would expect it to be.
Great. That's what the people need to know.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our conversation with Bill Mustain, where we discuss the chemistry of battery storage, competitiveness, and the future of battery innovation in the battery belt. Thank you for listening, and follow the Battery Belt podcast for more on how the American Southeast is shaping the future of mobility, innovation, industry, and everyday life.